Never spoke. The needle missed the vein on the first try, and nobody in that room said a word about it. Me, the patient, was 63. A retired schoolteacher named Gerald Pham, who had driven himself to Northgate Regional because his chest had been doing something strange for 2 days, and he'd finally run out of reasons to ignore it. He was sitting upright on the gurney in Bay 4, calm in the way that frightened people got calm when they decided to trust the process. And the resident working his IV line was on his 3rd attempt now, jaw tight, the kind of focus that was really just performance, because he didn't want to ask for help. A soldier spoke. Caitlin Marsh watched from the supply corridor. She had a clipboard. She had an inventory checklist. She had 6 weeks of knowing exactly when to make herself small enough that nobody looked at her directly. And she used all 3 of those things to stay exactly where she was. While the resident, Dr. Kyle Ferris, tried the 4th site and this time got it. And the line was in. Gerald Pham exhaled. Ferris peeled off his gloves with the precise movements of someone recalibrating their sense of themselves. Come on her, folks. She went back to counting saline bags. That was how it worked at Northgate. Was how it had worked since the morning she'd arrived. With a duffel bag and a nursing license and a personnel file that HR had processed, without asking why half of it was missing. She'd been assigned to supply rotation before she'd even been shown where the break room was. Ramona Dempsey's orders. Charge Nurse Deborah Finch had explained it with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided the conversation was already finished before it began. We have a structure here, Finch had said, not unkindly, just with the finality of something that had been true for a long time and wasn't going to become untrue because of one new hire. New staff starts on rotation. It's standard. I understand, Caitlin had said. And she had. She'd understood perfectly. Men. Finch was 49, with silver hair she wore in a precise knot, and the posture of someone who had built a department through will and repetition and wasn't especially interested in examining either. She was competent. Caitlin had recognized that in the first hour, the kind of competence that came from doing a thing correctly for long enough that you stopped distinguishing between the right way and your way. Men spoke. What she hadn't recognized, not immediately, was the other thing. The way Finch's competence had a boundary, and the boundary was her. It took 2 weeks to see it clearly. By then, Caitlin had established a rhythm. Arrive early, work the rotation, stay quiet, go home to the apartment in St. Albert she'd furnished from a combination of a Habitat restore run and whatever the previous tenant had left behind. A coffee maker. A couch the color of old mustard. A bookshelf with 4 books on it that she kept meaning to add to and hadn't. She ran in the mornings. The North Saskatchewan River Valley had trails that went on long enough that she could lose track of herself for 40 minutes, which was the point. She had a therapist, Dr. Ewan Calloway, who worked out of a clinic on 97th Street with a white noise machine in the hall outside the door, and a talent for asking questions that circled things without quite landing on them until you were ready. Abide, what does quiet feel like to you right now? Ewan had asked in their first session. Experiments. Safe, Caitlin had said. And then, because Ewan had a quality of waiting that made honesty feel less expensive than it usually did, and a little like holding my breath. Written something down. Ewan had written something down. Caitlin hadn't asked what. Goodness. The shift that changed the shape of everything started like any other Tuesday. The crash cart in Bay I-2 when she heard it. Not felt. Heard. Not felt. Though the distinction got complicated at that frequency. The sound entered the building the way it always had. Not through the doors or the walls, but through some other channel, some part of her nervous system that had been calibrated to it for 3 years, as before she'd spent the last 2 trying to uncalibrate. Rotors. Multiple aircraft. close and coming closer. Defibrillator pads. She set down the medevac. Outside the high windows of the emergency department, she could see the angle of the approach, and it was wrong for a civilian medevac. Too fast, too deliberate, the kind of approach that had a specific names and contexts she no longer officially belonged to. One soldier spoke. The radio at the nurse's station started making noise before the aircraft were even on the ground. The messenger spoke. Then the ambulance bay doors opened, and they weren't subtle about it. And 6 people came through in tactical gear. Not RCMP, not military police. Something that existed in the gap between those two things. The kind of unit that didn't announce itself and didn't need to. Behind them, a gurney moving at the controlled speed that meant time had already been spent, and there wasn't much left. And running compressions on the gurney was doing it right. Full weight. Correct depth, not the modified version people defaulted to when they were trying not to break something. The ER staff froze. And Finch appeared from her office. Whatever she'd been about to say died somewhere in the 2 meters between her door and the sight of 6 people in tactical vests filling her department. Spoke. The one at the front spoke. Not loudly. He had a voice like something that had learned to project without effort. Come on, we need Falcon. Sometimes the room didn't breathe. Talking to Finch? He wasn't talking to Finch. He wasn't talking to Ferris, who had appeared from somewhere looking like a man who had stepped into a conversation in the middle and was trying to locate the beginning. He was talking to nobody in particular, which meant he was talking to whoever in this room knew what the name meant. Falcon is here, he said again, more precisely. We were told Falcon transferred here. This man has maybe 4 minutes. Caitlin set down her clipboard. Matey. She walked out of the supply corridor past Finch, past Ferris, past the 2 nurses who had pressed themselves against the wall in the instinctive way of people who understood that something bigger than them was happening and weren't sure where to put themselves. She walked straight to the gurney and looked at the patient. Male. Late 30s. Tactical clothing cut away to access a chest wound on the right side that was, even through the improvised field dressing, visibly compromising. Neck veins distended. The field seal they'd applied was holding, barely, but the tension was building, and would kill him before anything else did if it wasn't released. What's his name? She said. A soldier spoke. The man at the front of the group looked at her the way people looked when they recognized someone they'd been told they might not recognize. Something shifted in his face. Something that had been tight came slightly loose. Gagnon, he said. Surgeon Claude Gagnon. How long since the injury? 90 minutes. Field seal at 35. In the wound. She looked at the monitor one of the tactical medics had running. She looked at Gagnon's color, which was the color of someone whose body was making decisions about priorities. 1, she said. Not to anyone specific. To the room. Mandy, you are absolutely not authorized. Finch started. Tension pneumothorax developing. Caitlin said it evenly, not loudly. Bay 1 now, or he dies on this gurney. Spoke. There was a half-second pause that felt longer. Then 2 of the staff nurses moved. Not because anyone told them to, but because the situation had a gravity, and they were moving inside it. An entire Fochin filled the rogams. And burst on this, and he Simon said, and come with me, she said. He said. You can take over the moment you're ready. And wait for his answer. She moved with the gurney. Arguments were gain. In Bay 1, she had 20 seconds to assess what she was working with. A nurse named Sylvie Fontaine, who had been at Northgate for 8 years, and had the practical efficiency of someone who'd seen enough to know when to ask questions and when to just hand over equipment. A nurse named Barry Chow, newer, who looked frightened in the useful way. The kind of fear that produced attention rather than paralysis. Engage. Caitlin said. Second intercostal, mid-clavicular line. Maiden. Fontaine had already pulled the tray. Commands. Caitlin placed the needle. Terminate. The rush of air was immediate and audible. The monitor showed a change. Not good, not yet, but the downward trajectory stopped. I need a chest tube, she said. Get me, Anand said, and she had it. And Kumar? She worked the way she'd learned to work in places where the wrong decision meant the decision was the last one you made. Not fast in the way that looked impressive, fast in the way that mattered, which was sequential and certain, and without the quarter-second hesitations that came from needing to think about the next step instead of being already there. Command, Gagnon's saturation started climbing. Grenady. Ferris was in the doorway. He'd come in, she registered, which said something. He was watching with his arms loosely at his sides rather than crossed, which said something else. Thoracic surgeon, Caitlin said, not to Ferris. Specifically, not as a challenge, just as a fact. Whoever you have on call. Galale is on call, Barry said. He's already been paged. A monitor. At Gagnon. At the chest tube, doing its quiet work. Good, she said, and she stayed where she was. Hands where they were, eyes on the numbers, and let the room settle around what had just happened. Bay 1. She could hear Finch's voice, elevated, the particular register of someone whose authority had been crossed, and was in the process of deciding what to do about it. She didn't go out there yet. Astrophalic was standing at the edge of the bay. He hadn't entered, hadn't interfered. He had the stillness of someone who understood that the best thing you could do in a room with an ongoing crisis was make yourself useful by being out of the way. In Honors News. When the monitor numbers stabilized into something that looked like survivable, he exhaled. I don't know his name. She still didn't know his name. Him in the break room. She found out in the break room. His name was Commander Thierry Marchand, and he sat across from her at the small table with the overhead light that buzzed slightly, and put his hands flat on the surface and said, "We've been looking for 2 months." "In hiding?" Caitlin said. "No," he said. "You were being careful. There's a difference, and we respected it, until we couldn't." She looked at the table. The previous person to sit here had left a coffee ring she had not made, and was not going to clean up right now. "Gagnon," she said. His unit's medevac was grounded in the weather window. The civilian hospital in the nearest corridor didn't have the capacity. Someone in the operations command chain had your transfer location on file. He paused. Someone who knew what Falcon meant, and what it was worth. Good. She hadn't used that name in 2 years. She'd packed it with the rest of the things she'd packed when she left. She thought it had stayed in the box. "He's going to make it to surgery," she said. "The rest is Bozalale." "Bozalale good?" "Good enough." She said it the way she said things that were true and didn't need decorating. Vomit. Marchand looked at her for a long moment. He had the quality of someone who had learned to read rooms by reading people, and was doing both simultaneously. "Goodness, you look different," he said. "And I work in supply, so what?" He didn't react to that the way she'd expected. He didn't push back, didn't express the kind of offended surprise that would have felt like a different kind of pressure. He just said, "I know. I saw your rotation assignments." "Come in." Something in the way he said it made her go still. "Gonna cedar cow." Come spoke. "Because when we found where you'd transferred, we looked at how you'd been deployed in the department." He said it carefully, the way people said things that contained more than their surface. 6 weeks of supply rotation. For a nurse with your qualifications. He paused. That didn't look like a standard probationary period. She didn't answer. "Why we came," he said. "We came because Gagnon needed you specifically. But what we saw when we looked..." He stopped. It didn't sit right. In the break room, She could hear the ER continuing to function around the disruption. Monitors, the PA, someone's cart, normal sounds. She focused on them the way UN had taught her. Concrete, present, real. "I'm gonna file something," Caitlin said. "Finch. She'll call it unauthorized treatment." The commander spoke. "She can call it whatever she wants," Marchand said. "We have helmet cam footage from all 6 team members from the moment we cleared the bay doors. Every intervention you made is timestamped and documented as part of the operational medical record." "Men?" She stared at him. "I'm unprepared," he said. A little way outside, she heard Finch's voice again, sharper now, the direction of it suggesting a phone call rather than a conversation. And underneath that, Ferris's voice, quieter, the particular register of someone working through something they hadn't expected to have to work through. "The bite?" She went back inside. Because the ER didn't stop, because of whatever was happening in the administrative layer above it. It kept going, and the work kept needing doing, and she was here and capable, and that was the argument she'd been making for 6 weeks by showing up and being ignored. Organized, she went back to the work. Argument? Finch found her 20 minutes later at the supply station, because of course she did. Finch had the tenure and the authority and the certainty that had built up around both of those things like sediment, and a situation that had gone publicly sideways was not something she was going to let exist in her department without addressing it in person. "Come in. What you did in there," Finch said, "was outside the scope of your assigned rotation." "Yes," Caitlin said. Finch blinked. She'd expected an argument, or a defense, or at minimum a flinch. "I'm going to need you to document every decision you made from the moment those individuals came through the doors." "Okay." Make clear that whatever military documentation exists, this hospital operates under provincial health authority standards. "Dr. Finch," Caitlin said it quietly, without heat. "The patient is alive. That documentation you're asking for is going to show exactly why." She looked up from the supply cart. "I'll have it to you by end of shift." Streams. Finch held her gaze for 3 seconds. Something moved across her face that Caitlin couldn't fully identify. Not exactly anger, but the cousin of it, the thing anger became when it encountered something it couldn't dismiss. Away without answering. So combat administrator, the hospital administrator, a man named Gordon Whitfield, arrived on the floor at 11:43, much to drawn. Caitlin knew who he was because she'd seen him once during her onboarding and formed the impression of a person who made decisions based on how they'd look in documentation rather than how they'd hold up to scrutiny. A man. Just the kind of man who had learned to protect the institution first and evaluate the human component after. He came to find her. That surprised her slightly. "Nurse Marsh," he said. "Do you have a few minutes?" She had a few minutes. In the consultation room Whitfield chose was small, 2 chairs and a table and a clock and a hand sanitizer dispenser. The room hospitals used when the conversation needed walls. Non. "I've been in contact with the command unit's legal representative," Whitfield said. He had the particular voice of someone reading from a script he'd written too recently to have memorized. Also had a conversation with. He paused, recalibrating. "With one of your colleagues. Mr. Barry Chow. Awareness used to Verkin. He had some observations about the treatment you provided and about the broader context of your assignment to this department." Caitlin waited. "I'm going to need to review your personnel file." "My file is limited," she said, "as your HR department would have noted when they processed it." "The command unit's legal representative has offered to provide a supplementary document to our administration with your consent." He looked at the table. "A summary of your service record, the relevant portions." She thought about what that meant, about what becoming less redacted cost, and what it bought. Need. What kind of summary, she said. Your role. Your operational experience in trauma settings. He stopped. I think it would clarify a number of things. Sure spoke. The number of things that need clarifying, Caitlin said, includes why I've been on supply rotation for 6 weeks, while nurses with 18 months of experience were assigned to trauma support. Whitfield looked at the wall, just briefly. That's part of what I want to discuss. All right, she said. Go ahead. I'm in the consultation room for 25 minutes. He asked questions the way administrators asked questions when they were already revising their understanding with each answer. She gave him what she could, said so clearly when she couldn't, and by the end had a reasonable sense of where things stood. Marchand. She came out of the room to find Marchand in the corridor. He's out of surgery, he said. Everything else stopped. Come in. When? Come in. 40 minutes ago. Beausoleil said it went well, he said. And here Marchand's voice did something she hadn't heard it do before, the professional control thinning just slightly at the edges. That whoever placed the chest tube gave him exactly the window he needed. Gadot? She stood in the corridor of Northgate Regional Medical Center and took one slow breath. Then another. She let Gagnon being alive be real before she said anything. And good, she said. It was enough. Combine? Marchand watched her. He asked for you when he came out of the anesthetic. To the floor. What did he say? He opened his eyes, looked at the ceiling, and said, Tell Falcon I owe her a coffee. Then he went back to sleep. Neared. She didn't smile. But something neared happened in her face briefly, and she didn't try to stop it. Give him a couple of hours, she said. What happened in those 2 hours was the part she hadn't expected, because she'd been focused on the immediate Gagnon, Finch, Whitfield, and not on the lateral movements happening in the rest of the institution. Gear, information. Hospitals moved information the way water moved through old buildings, through unexpected channels, around barriers that seemed solid, finding the low points. She was back at the supply station, doing the job she'd been assigned to do, because the job still needed doing. What happened in Beething. The shape of what had happened in Bay 1 had already traveled the length of the department 3 times and was on its second journey through the surgical floor. Irma spoke. Barry Chow found her at the station. Then a soldier spoke. He was 26, newer to nursing than she was to this specific hospital, and he had the face of someone who had made a decision and was still checking whether it had been the right one. Whitfield some things, he said. I know. And I've been watching your rotation for 5 weeks. The assignments, how they overlap with who gets trauma support time. He paused. It didn't add up, and I should have said something earlier. Modern, you said something now. I looked at his hands. I also found something. By accident. He lowered his voice slightly, not conspiratorially, but carefully. Dr. Ferris sent an email to Finch 3 days after you corrected his IV placement on a patient. I wasn't supposed to see it. It went to the charge team distribution list by mistake, and I was on it temporarily while I was doing scheduling training. Man, she waited. Meant. He called you a liability risk. He said your background was. He said uncertain, and that keeping you off patient-facing rotation made sense until the department could evaluate whether there were grounds for a formal review. He exhaled. I kept the email. I wasn't sure what to do with it. She was very still. Sibyl, what made you decide? She said. This morning. He said. What you did in Bay 1, and then watching Finch walk toward her office to call legal. He looked at her steadily. It felt like the same pattern. She thought about that, about the shape of a pattern. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and went back to work. He had been afraid. The second conversation with Whitfield happened at 2:15 in the larger conference room on the administrative floor. This time Marchand was in the room, which Caitlin had asked for, and Whitfield had, in a pause, agreed to. And this time there was a third person, a woman named Sandra Voss, from the RCMP's National Professional Standards Office, who had arrived at the hospital at noon, apparently maid, without calling ahead. Gurney was 50-something. With the posture of someone who'd been in rooms designed to intimidate and had stopped feeling it years ago. She had a legal pad and 2 external drives and a laptop and an expression that was professionally neutral in the specific way that meant she'd already decided something and was filling in the documentation around it. "I'll be direct," she said once they were seated. The operational documentation from this morning triggered a review. Standard protocol when civilian medical personnel are involved in a priority response. When we pulled the flag on your assignment records, we found a disparity. She turned the laptop. It was Caitlin's schedule, 6 weeks of it. Supply rotation, supply rotation, supply rotation, and next to it, in a second column, the trauma support assignments during the same period. Nurses with less seniority, less training, more patient-facing time. Disparity isn't necessarily actionable, Voss said. She reached for one of the drives. What's actionable is this. The email chain took 4 minutes to read. The room was quiet while she read it. Bill's message was 4 sentences. Sent 72 hours after the IV incident, he described her as a problem. Said, her background created uncertainty, suggested keeping her off patient-facing until the department could determine whether there were grounds to manage her out. Finch's response was longer, methodical, in the way that Finch was methodical about everything, laying out a use of the probationary structure that would keep Caitlin on supply indefinitely without triggering a performance review that might go in Caitlin's favor. There were 6 exchanges in total. The most recent was 11 days old. Finch had written, "She's not moving on her own. I'm considering whether a competency review makes sense, not based on performance, but to get ahead of things before she decides she has grounds to push back." A soldier spoke before she decides she has grounds to push back. Caitlin set the laptop down. Dr. Ferris initiated this, she said. His first email predates Finch's involvement by 72 hours, Voss confirmed. Corrected him. She said it, not as an accusation, just as a fact the way she'd say a saturation level or a dosage. He was on his 4th attempt at an IV line on a 63-year-old patient who'd been sitting there long enough. I was watching from the supply corridor. When he finally got the line, the relief on that patient's face. She stopped. Ferris caught me watching. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Documentation suggests he interpreted it as a professional challenge, Voss said. He interpreted someone being better at something as a threat, she said it evenly. That's a different thing. Jennings bowed her. Marchand beside her made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. And what happens now? Caitlin said. Voss turned a page in her legal pad. Now I speak with them, separately. And I look at what your HR department knew, because someone approved 6 consecutive weeks of supply rotation for a nurse with your qualifications, and I want to understand the sign-off on that. She paused. And I look at whether there's a provincial nursing college referral that makes sense. Then a soldier spoke. She hadn't expected that last part. The Provincial Nursing Authority, over nursing practice in Alberta, referral to them was a different category of consequence than anything Whitfield could produce on his own. Finch, Voss clarified. The use of scheduling authority to restrict patient-facing access outside of any formal disciplinary structure is something the college takes seriously. Whitfield, at the end of the table had the expression of a man taking his medicine. They pulled Finch first. Caitlin wasn't there for it. Because the R didn't pause for institutional accounting. It kept going. And the patients kept coming. And she was here and had hands and knew how to use them. Just drawn in. She heard about Finch's meeting from Sylvie Fontaine, who had a way of knowing things and distributing them with the economy of someone who understood that information was a resource. She went in with her tablet, Fontaine said, without looking up from her charting. She came out without it. At 3:10, Ferris went upstairs. His face, when he passed the nurse's station, had the quality of a man who had understood, possibly for the first time, that the room he was walking into was not going to resemble the room he'd pictured. Only spoke. What Caitlin knew from her own observation was that at 4:20, Northgate's HR director appeared in the department and asked Whitfield for a private word with an expression that suggested the word was going to be uncomfortable. She also knew that the department was moving differently around her. Not dramatically, not the performative overcorrection of a workplace caught doing something wrong and swinging the other way. And that. Fontaine falling into step beside her during a transfer and saying quietly, "I saw your work in Bay 1. I've been here 9 years. That's not supply nurse work." Not waiting for an answer. Just walking. To the soldier spoke, Barry, asking her opinion on a patient presentation without the half pause that had been there since she'd arrived. Some small adjustments. The room rearranging itself. Her. She didn't know quite what to do with it yet. She was working on that. Marchand found her at 4:55. He came into the ER with the particular look of someone who'd been in administrative territory for several hours and was recalibrating on the way back. "Voss is done with the preliminary interviews," he said. "She wants you again." Headline? Spoke. Ferris submitted a written statement. He said it with care. He acknowledged the email chain. He acknowledged that his initial message to Finch was a pause. Professionally motivated was the phrase. He was embarrassed, Caitlin said. About the IV. He wanted me gone because I'd been in the room when he struggled. His team read it the same way. Marchand's voice had an edge in it that she suspected didn't come out often. And Finch. He stopped. Finch built infrastructure around it. The rotation scheduling. The pre-planned competency review. That wasn't just going along with Ferris. That was its own project. Fake. She thought about 11 years of a department running a specific way, about how authority, accumulated long enough, stopped looking like a choice and started looking like a fact. Does Voss have authority to do anything that actually matters? She said. RCMP component gives her investigative reach over anything that impacted the operational response this morning. Gagnon's case clears that threshold. He folded his jacket over his arm. She's also made a referral to the College of Registered Nurses of Alberta. Regarding Finch, the scheduling conditions, the email chain, the pre-planned competency review. Not a small thing, Caitlin said. When he agreed, it's not. She went back upstairs. Answered. The second meeting with Voss was shorter and more precise. Voss asked specific questions, and Caitlin answered them with the same economy she used for patient reports. Exactly what was asked, no less and no more. And a soldier spoke. At the end of it, Voss looked at her legal pad and then looked at Caitlin and said, "I want to ask you something that's outside the formal scope of this review." All right. Fortin. This morning, when they came through those doors and called your call sign, what was the first thing you felt? Caitlin looked at the window. St. Albert was doing the thing it did in late October, the light going flat and gray over the river valley, the specific quality of a place settling into the serious part of autumn. I'd been holding my breath for 2 years, she said, and I wasn't sure if exhaling was safe yet. I nodded once. Is it? For me in a month, Caitlin said. A man's expression. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. Fair enough. Meeting was 6. The staff meeting was at 6, in the administration conference room that smelled like recycled air and institutional carpet. Most of the department stayed for it, including people whose shifts had ended. Those absences, Finch's chair, Ferris's chair, were louder than anything, Whitfield said. The later spoke. Whitfield stood at the front with the posture of a man who'd revised his speech several times that afternoon and was delivering the latest version. Amant, I want to be direct with this department, he said. The rotation structure for Nurse Marshart over the past 6 weeks was not consistent with her qualifications. It should have been reviewed. That's a failure at multiple levels of this institution, including at the administrative level. He looked at Caitlin. Not away, directly. I want to name that clearly. And 2 seats down, exhaled audibly. The woman looked at the table. There was nothing she needed to say in this room that the morning hadn't already said. And she found Barry Chow in the break room. Who made that email? For how long, she said. Weeks. He was making tea, something with dried ginger in it that smelled sharp and clean. I kept second-guessing myself. Whether it was my place, whether I'd read it right. He looked at the kettle. This morning made it clear. It cost you something, she said. And he considered that honestly. I've been a nurse for 2 years. I already know what it means when someone more experienced gets sidelined and nobody says anything. He poured water into the mug. Better to say something late than not say it. And she said, It is. Mine buzzed. Marchand's number. I'm asking for you. Also, we found something in Ferris's previous employment file, before Northgate. You need to see it. And she read it twice. Before Northgate. He went to find Gagnon first, because whatever was in that file had been true before today and would still be true in 20 minutes. And Gagnon was awake and asking for her, now. Come on her soon, he was in a private recovery room. Marchand had arranged that quietly, with the efficiency of someone who'd been arranging things for people in difficult situations. Long enough that it was automatic in me. He was pale under the hospital light, drainage tube, monitoring equipment, the specific reduced look of a capable person knocked horizontal by their own body. His left side was immobilized. Then a Mulger spoke, but his eyes were open and tracking, and when she came through the door, they found her immediately. There she is, he said. His voice was rough, post-anesthetic, like it had been dragged up from somewhere deep. Come on. There you are, she said. She pulled the chair to the side of the bed. How do you feel? Someone's. Put a tube in my chest. And someone did. Was it you? In the tube, yes. The surgery was Biozalale. Nosabut. Bozalale good? Very. He was quiet for a moment. Then, they told me you were doing supply rotation. I was. Supply. He said the word the way you said, something that didn't make sense. Caitlin Marsh, supply. He looked at the ceiling. I thought about you on the bird. When things were... He stopped. The sentence was too long for where he was. I kept thinking you were out there somewhere, doing something that had nothing to do with what you're actually for. She looked at the monitors. At the drainage tube. You just had major thoracic surgery, she said. Save it. He prepared it in advance. His mouth moved toward something close to a smile. 40 minutes in the air. That's time. Her eyes closed, heavier. You're not going back to supply. You don't get to decide that. No, he agreed, fading. But I think something already did. That. She sat with him until he was fully asleep, which took about 3 minutes. She watched his breathing even out, watched the monitors settle into the slower rhythms of a body doing the serious work of repair. About what he'd said. Something already did. What's wrong? She'd felt the shift when she walked out of Whitfield's office the first time. The way the architecture of how she existed in this place had changed in ways that couldn't be changed back. The smaller life she'd built, the supply cart, the morning runs, the deliberately bounded existence. It had served its purpose, she knew that. She didn't regret it. She'd needed the quiet, not the reduced scale, the distance from the years that had been too loud. Livable and livable weren't the same thing. She'd been feeling that gap widen for a while, without having a name for it. A name for it now. When she came out, Marchand was in the car. Show me, she said. He handed her his phone. The document was a professional conduct complaint, filed 14 months ago at a hospital in British Columbia. Lions Gate in North Vancouver. The complainant was a senior nurse named Ctrl+Alt+Z, and the complaint was specific and detailed. That Dr. Ganal Ferris, then a resident, responded to her public correction of his line placement during an emergency. Procedure. By filing a formal competency concern against her with the department head, a concern that contained no clinical basis, but that triggered an administrative review process lasting 4 months. Had been cleared. Arsenault had been cleared. But by the time the review concluded, she'd been on modified duties long enough that 2 positions she'd applied for had gone to other candidates. Lyons spoke. She'd left Lionsgate 7 months after the complaint. Her current nursing registration was listed as inactive. Spoke. Carol Arsenault had corrected an IV line. She'd watched a resident struggle and said something about it, and it had cost her career. Aback, Caitlin handed the phone back. This before, she said. Documented record. At least once with a documented record. Voss thinks there may be others. She's asked Lionsgate for further personnel records. Mind, he came to Northgate 8 months after the complaint. Lionsgate marked it as administratively resolved and gave a clean reference. Marchand's jaw was set. The complaint is being reopened for retroactive review by the British Columbia College of Nurses. Spoke. She stood in the corridor with the weight of Carol Arsenault's name settling somewhere she would carry it. Her name this morning, she said. I won't forget it now. Marchand said. I don't think you will. Good night. She went home that night, to the apartment with the old mustard couch and the bookshelf with 4 books on it. She made tea. She didn't particularly want and sat on the couch and let the day run backward through her memory. The way her brain always processed things when it was too tired for anything else. Gagnon's monitors, Voss's legal pad, Whitfield in the consultation room, revising his understanding in real time, Barry's tea that smelled like ginger, the email chain, Ferris's 4 sentences, Finch's methodical architecture around them. The needle going into Gagnon's chest, the rush of air, the monitor changing direction. The 6 weeks before all of it. Train. At some point she fell asleep sitting up, which told her something about how much her body had been carrying without announcing it. Coming to Tilling Committee, met the following morning. She wasn't there. Her role was already in the documentation, and documentation didn't require her presence. Commented Ian. Whitfield called before her shift to tell her about the assignment change. He did it personally, not through the scheduling system. She understood that was its own kind of statement. You've been moved to emergency trauma support, he said. Effective today. Thank you, she said, and hung up. In Bay 3. Before the first patient came in, Fontaine was doing pre-shift setup. She looked up when Caitlin walked in. Mentally, she said. Come on in. Don't, Caitlin said. Come in. Fontaine turned back to the supply tray. Supply rotation was not your calling. Okay? Can we focus on the shift? Singh, Fontaine said, and she was smiling at the tray, which seemed like the right response given everything. And the morning was what ER mornings were. Not catastrophic, just continuous. A construction worker with a laceration that needed more attention than it looked like. A woman in her 70s with a medication interaction. 3 specialists had missed. A teenager with an asthma technique that had been wrong for years, and nobody had taken the time to fix. She worked. She was good at it. That hadn't changed in 6 weeks of supply rotation, and it didn't change overnight. It had just been given a different room. Barry found her between patients. Committee's done. Command. She waited. Nodger spoke. Ferris has been suspended, pending a full review of his cases from the past 8 months. Whitfield is in contact with Lions Gate. The Arsenault complaint has been formally reopened. He paused. British Columbia College confirmed receipt this morning. She thought about Carol Arsenault, whose registration was inactive, who had left a job she was good at, because a resident's ego had been treated as more important than her right to do it. She hoped Arsenault found out what had been reopened. She hoped it mattered. And Finch, she said. College of Registered Nurses received Voss's referral. Formal inquiry starts in 3 weeks. Whitfield's placed her on paid administrative leave in the interim. Barry's voice was careful. She took her things this morning. Audited. Caitlin nodded. Immediate. It was the shape of accountability in the real world. Not clean, not immediate. Investigations with timelines, processes that would take months, outcomes that were uncertain. Ferris suspended, but not yet adjudicated. Finch on leave, but not yet resolved. Carol Arsenault's complaint open, but not yet heard. The machinery of consequence was slow and imperfect, and sometimes ground the wrong things entirely, but it was moving. The emails were on record. The footage was on record. Gagnon was alive, and the operational documentation that had preserved his life had her name on it, and none of that was going back into a drawer. Woman had died. She did not see Finch that day. Administrative leave meant what it said, and she was grateful for the clarity of it. Woman titted. What she did see, at the end of a shift that had been long and complicated, and full of exactly the kind of work she was here to do, was the thing she hadn't expected. She was in the corridor near the charge desk when she heard it. Ferris's voice, from around the corner, low, talking to no one she could see. He wasn't on duty. He'd been sent home that morning. But he'd come back for something, a form or a belonging. And he hadn't left yet. Sybil spoke. She rounded the corner, and they were 3 feet apart with nowhere graceful to go. Commenced is drawn. He looked like someone who had been thinking very hard about something for many hours and hadn't landed anywhere satisfying. Marsh, he said. Dr. Ferris. Alarmed Wolves. A pause. The hallway was not empty, but nobody was close enough to be part of what this was. Line, he said. On Gerald Pham. The first shift. He said it carefully, the way you said something that had been embedded somewhere and was being removed slowly. You were watching. It meaned I was. You didn't say anything. It's meaning. But I knew you'd seen it. He looked at the wall, and instead of letting it be a thing that happened, I made it into something else. He stopped. Started again. I made it into something that needed to be managed. I made it about you, instead of about me. He exhaled. That was wrong, and it cost someone else a career before it cost me anything. Mandal's name. Carol Arsenault's name was in the air between them without being spoken. Steadily. Yes, she said. It did. Once and stepped aside. She passed. On, she thought, walking away, that he might be okay eventually. He had enough intelligence to understand what he'd done, which was the necessary first condition. Whether understanding turned into something better or calcified into resentment was not something she could predict. And she had enough to carry without adding his trajectory to it. Before she left the building. Before she left the Ginna. At her, he was sitting up. More color in his face, the specific kind that came from a body choosing to continue. The drainage tube was still doing its work, but the monitors had settled into something that looked stable and sustainable. "You look better," she said. "I got shot," he said, "which I did, but better." He watched her sit down. "The committee met this morning. Not as a band. Things are moving." He was quiet for a moment. He had the patience of someone who had learned to wait for information rather than push for it. "Marchand told me about RCMP. Yes. Did you know before today?" Racine. He looked at the window, the October gray of it. 11 months, he said. That's how long she was in it before she left. 11 months of someone's machinery grinding her down. He turned back. "You had 6 weeks." "I know. You're harder to grind down." "I had fewer moving parts to grab onto," she said. "I came in with my history folded up. Less surface area." She paused. "It was supposed to protect me. It did some, but it also," she considered, "it also made me invisible in ways I didn't always choose." Gagnon was quiet. He had the quality of someone who listened to the thing under the thing. "You're not going to be invisible anymore," he said. And she agreed. "I don't think I am." She left him to sleep and walked down the corridor toward the exit, and she was almost to the ambulance bay doors when she saw Marchand coming the other way. He was holding something. She recognized what it was before he held it out. A unit patch. Worn at one edge from handling, the kind of wear that was from being carried rather than used. The insignia she'd known for 3 years and packed away in the bottom of a box with the other things she'd packed when she left. Gibbo spoke. "This was in the operational kit," he said. "We brought it, not expecting to give it to you today, expecting to give it whenever you were ready." He had it in his palm. She didn't reach for it immediately. "A nurse," she said. "That's what I am. That's what I'm here to do." "No," Marchand said. "So take it as what it is, not as a pullback to something else. Take it as a record that both things are true." She picked it up. It was lighter than it looked. It always had been, and she'd always been surprised by that. How something that carried so much could weigh so little in your hand. For a moment, she held it for a moment, thought it woman who'd first earned it. What that woman had survived and what it had cost her, and what she'd built in the aftermath, and whether any of it had been wasted. She didn't think it had. The 2 years of quiet, the morning runs, UN cedar-smelling office, the supply cart and the deliberate smallness of it. It had been what it needed to be. Shelter, not surrender. Rest, not disappear. Not Tsibirgi. The difference between the two was what she'd been trying to find for 2 years. Part of her spoke. She slipped the patch into the pocket of her scrubs. "We'll be in touch," she said. Not a question. Marchand said. "But not to pull you back in. Just in touch." "Good." The non-mind. Gagnon's voice, from behind them. He'd apparently been wheeled to the corridor for a short assisted walk and was making the most of the proximity. "Marsh." She turned. The Braham. He was leaning slightly on the rail, careful with his left side but upright. His face had the look of a man who had something prepared. "Don't spend the next 2 years on the shelf," he said. "I'm going to interpret that as a metaphor about personal growth," she said, "and not commentary on my institutional reassignment." "It's both," he said, and let the physio aide turn him back toward the room. "Men?" She watched them go. "Men?" The corridor was ordinary again. She stood in it with her hand against the patch in her pocket. Then she turned and walked back toward the ER. The formal commendation from the Federal Command arrived at Northgate Regional Medical Center. It was addressed to Caitlin Marsh, RN. It cited her role in the stabilization of a priority personnel asset under time-critical conditions. It was carbon copied to the hospital administration, to the College of Registered Nurses of Alberta, and to the Provincial Health Authority. Field had it framed. She found out when she arrived for a Wednesday shift, and there it was on the wall near the charge desk, between the emergency evacuation diagram and the cardiac algorithm poster. Fontaine was already there. Fontaine said, whether to put it up. And guide? Unanimous. A pause that contained two specific absences without naming them. Everyone still here. Caitlin looked at it. Her name, in official type, on the wall of the department where she'd inventoried saline bags and restocked crash carts and been called the supply. Supply nurse in conversations she was close enough to hear. She thought about the woman who had arrived here 7 weeks ago with a duffel bag and a redacted file, and a deliberate intention to take up as little space as possible. She understood why she'd made that choice. She didn't regret it. Invisibility was only shelter if you were planning to leave it eventually. If you stayed, it became a different kind of trap. Not the trap someone else built. The one you assembled yourself, careful and private, brick by brick. She had walked out from behind a supply cart until she was still here. Touched the frame once, briefly. Then picked up the chart at Station 1. 47-year-old male, shortness of breath, oxygen saturation 89 on room air, history of COPD. She read it in the time it took to walk to the curtain. She pushed the curtain aside, and the man looked up. Frightened, trying not to show it, the particular expression of someone who had been convincing themselves for 3 days that this could wait. She looked back at him with the full, unhurried attention of someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. How long it's been, she said. And she listened. That was the thing. It had always been the thing. Not the call sign, not the commendation on the wall, not the operational record, with her name in federal type. Then a soldier spoke, the quality of attention she brought to the space between a person and their worst moment. The willingness to be fully present there, without the protective distance of someone going through motions, again, without the half-presence of someone who'd stopped believing the work was worth their full self. At a minimum, she had never stopped bringing it. Not in the forward positions, not in the transfer wards, not in 6 weeks of supply rotation, in a department that had decided she was furniture. And that was who she was. It had always been who she was. And now the room that knew it. I keep thinking about the needle. Not the one Caitlin placed in Gagnon's chest, the one Ferris missed. 4 attempts on a 63-year-old man who was sitting there quietly, trusting the process, and a resident who couldn't ask for help because asking for help meant admitting he didn't know something. That's where it started, not with a conspiracy, not with malice from the beginning. A man who couldn't tolerate being seen not knowing. Everything that followed, the emails, the rotation assignments, the pre-planned competency review, grew out of that one moment of wounded pride, looking for somewhere to put itself. I've been thinking about what it actually takes to do the right thing when the wrong thing is quieter and costs you nothing. Barry kept that email for 3 weeks. He wasn't in a position of power. He was 2 years into his career, and watching someone more experienced get quietly managed toward the door, and he kept the evidence of it in his inbox while he decided what it meant, and he decided what it meant, and what he owed a person he barely knew. That's not a small thing. That's the kind of integrity that doesn't get noticed when it happens. Gear, only when it didn't happen, and you're looking back at what the absence cost. Gurney. Garrett. In the original story, the nurse who kept those emails, and Barry here, they both made the same calculation. That what you've witnessed becomes, in some way, your responsibility. Not in a legal sense, in the older sense. The one that doesn't have a formal name, but that most of us recognize when we feel the weight of it. In a mini Comte, Caitlin's version of that same quality looked different because it was quieter. She spent 6 weeks absorbing a situation that was designed to make her doubt herself, and she didn't perform grievance or push back in ways that would have given Finch grounds to escalate. She just kept showing up and doing the work correctly. Not as strategy, as character. Not, the supply cart logs were accurate. The crash carts were properly stocked. And here's the discrepancy she flagged in week 1 was flagged because it mattered, not because anyone was watching. She was the same person in the supply corridor as she'd been in the field. That consistency, doing the job fully, even when no one's looking and nothing's at stake, except doing it right. That's what I find myself thinking about most. And Holy One. And then there's the harder question. What do you do with the intelligence to see a situation clearly when acting on what you see carries a cost? Caitlin understood from the first week what was happening. Made gay. She had the experience to read Finch's system, Ferris's ego, the shape of what was being built around her. She could see it, and she chose deliberately not to spend herself fighting it on their terms. That's not passivity. That's a different kind of precision, knowing which problems you solve by confronting them and which ones you solve by outlasting them. Arsenal didn't have that outcome. Her complaint was opened retroactively, from the outside, by people who only found her because they were looking for someone else. That's the part that stays with me. She did the same right thing Caitlin did. She corrected a mistake in real time, because a patient's safety was at stake, and it cost her everything. The difference wasn't in her integrity. It wasn't in her skill. It was in whether anyone kept the email. What I take from all of it is something I don't know how to make neat. That doing the right thing is not a guarantee of anything, but it is a record. It accumulates. It becomes the thing that someone who didn't know your name finds in a file 14 months later and decides is worth reopening. Caitlin walked out from behind that supply cart because a man was dying, and she was the one who could help him. She wasn't thinking about vindication. She was thinking about the needle placement and the timeline, and whether the field seal was going to hold another 4 minutes. The outcome followed from that. Not because the universe rewards good people, but because actions have weight, and weight accumulates, and eventually the structure built around a lie can't hold the documentation that contradicts it. God, that feels true to me. And it feels like enough to work with.